Harlem, New York. 3:11 p.m. Tuesday, March 18, 1952. Rain crawls down the tall windows of PS 136, turning the gray afternoon into something darker. The hallways stink of wet wool coats, chalk dust, and cheap floor polish. Children's voices leak under classroom doors, high and nervous, like they already understand this city runs on fear and favoritism. Inside room 3B, a white woman in a stiff navy blue dress adjusts the pearls at her throat. She is 38 years old, divorced and exhausted by a world she believes is beneath her. Her name is Margaret Collins. On the blackboard behind her, long division fights for space with a crooked American flag and a printed sign, "Good manners, good future." At 3:12 p.m., the door opens quietly. A small black girl in a neat cardigan and carefully pressed skirt slips in, clutching a folder to her chest. Her hair is tied back with a faded pink ribbon that her mother re-ironed that morning. Her name is Ruth Johnson. She is 11. She is late by exactly 4 minutes. Collins does not ask why. There is no curiosity about the broken-down subway train, or the stalled bus, or the wet shoes Ruth had to outrun. There is only annoyance, weaponized, precise. "Miss Johnson," Collins says, loud enough for every head in the room to swivel. "You people can't follow simple rules, can you?" The room goes silent. Chalk dust hangs in the air like suspended judgment. Ruth freezes. She has heard "you people" before, in stores, on street corners, from men leaning on squad cars. But here, in a classroom where grades and futures are handed out like rations, the words land with surgical cruelty. Collins steps closer. She smiles without warmth. "Stand up," she orders. "Let's show the class what happens when someone from your background thinks the rules don't apply." Ruth rises slowly. Her chair scrapes the floor, a long, painful sound. "Look at her," Collins says, turning to the other children. "This is why some of you will never amount to anything. Late. Lazy. Unprepared. Just like her father, I'm sure, if he's even around." A few children stare at their desks, ashamed for her. Others watch, terrified, learning a lesson that has nothing to do with arithmetic. Ruth's cheeks burn. She doesn't cry. Her father told her once, "They win when you leak." Collins leans down, close enough that Ruth can smell the bitter coffee on her breath. "You will write 'I will not be late' 100 times tonight," she says. "And if you don't like it, Miss Johnson, you can go back to whatever slum you crawled out of. This is a school, not a jungle." The word jungle hangs in the air like a slur that everyone understands and nobody will repeat out loud. At 3:26 p.m., class ends. Chairs scrape. Books slam. Children file out, tripping over each other to escape the tension. Ruth stays silent. She walks down the hallway with slow, measured steps, her eyes fixed straight ahead. She does not run. She does not complain. She does not report it to the principal. She doesn't have to. Because 11 blocks away, at 3:41 p.m., a man in a dark overcoat and a perfectly knotted tie listens to her story at a kitchen table smelling of collard greens and cigarette smoke. His shoes are polished. His hat is angled just right. He has a scar over his left eye and a reputation that travels faster than the subway. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't slam his fist. He doesn't promise revenge. He just stares at his daughter until she looks up from her untouched plate. "What was her name?" he asks, calm, like he's asking for the time. "Mrs. Collins," Ruth whispers. "Margaret Collins." Bumpy nods once. Files the name away with brutal precision. At 4:03 p.m., he lights a cigarette, exhales slowly, and says 8 words that will alter the balance of power inside a public school funded by people who don't know his name but depend on his money. Nobody talks to my blood like that. Nobody. 72 hours later, PS 136 will receive the largest single anonymous donation in its history. A donation accompanied by a typed note that will never make it into any official report, that no journalist will ever see, but that every administrator in that building will remember for the rest of their working lives. One teacher will be quietly transferred. A principal will develop a sudden, urgent respect for every black child who walks through his doors. And the message will be clear: in this part of Harlem, disrespect carries a price. The story of how Margaret Collins lost everything is a warning that history has tried to hide. If you enjoy these deep dives into the underworld, you can support the channel by buying me a coffee using the link in the description. Your support keeps these investigations alive. Now let's go back to March 18, 1952. The classroom windows of PS 136 collected rain like they collected lies about integration. On paper, this red brick fortress in 1952 Harlem was proof of progress. In practice, the lines were drawn with surgical precision. White teachers commanded mostly black students. Black janitors served white administrators. The architecture of separation built itself when the system provided the foundation, and everyone understood the geography without a single posted sign. Margaret Collins thrived in this imbalance. At 38, she was the daughter of Irish dock workers who had crawled up from tenement poverty to claim a narrow slice of respectability. Her father died believing America owed him something it never delivered. Her ex-husband left for a younger woman with softer opinions. Collins possessed a teaching certificate, a rent-controlled apartment she could barely afford, and a bitterness that had calcified into what she mistook for standards. She viewed her assignment to Harlem not as an opportunity, but as a sentence to be endured. Watching the post-war wave of black families moving into her territory, she felt her own status shrinking. Someone had to stay at the bottom of the ladder, and she would make sure it was not her. In Collins's mind, Room 3B was her kingdom. She controlled the chalk, the grades, the phone calls home that could destroy a child's future. She told herself it was discipline. In reality, it was retaliation against every door that had closed in her own face. Every time she looked at a black child, she saw a threat to her authority. Her solution was brutally simple: keep them in their place through systematic humiliation wrapped in the language of education. That morning, Ruth Johnson had woken to her mother's hands pressing every wrinkle from her cardigan with an iron heated on the stove. Education was the only escape route from hallways that smelled like other people's cooking and landlords who fixed nothing. Appearance was armor in this war. Ruth's mother tied her hair with a pink ribbon washed so many times the color had ghosted to pale memory. She checked homework twice, walked Ruth to the subway entrance, and delivered the daily instruction: keep your head up, speak clearly, give them no reason. The train stalled between stations at 2:47 p.m. Mechanical failure. No explanation. No apology. Ruth calculated distances, counted blocks she could run, measured seconds she might save. She arrived at 3:12 p.m., exactly 4 minutes after the bell. 4 minutes that would cost more than she understood. Collins was waiting. She had been watching the door with the particular satisfaction of someone who mistakes cruelty for duty. When Ruth entered, clutching her folder like a shield, Collins asked nothing. Questions implied the possibility of acceptable answers. Collins dealt in pronouncements. The words came measured, designed for maximum damage. You people. The phrase landed like a surgical cut. Collins made Ruth stand, made her visible, made her an example. She cataloged Ruth's failures in front of 23 witnesses who would remember this lesson longer than mathematics. Late meant lazy. Lazy meant predictable. Predictable meant deserving every limitation the world would impose. Collins mentioned Ruth's father with calculated vagueness, the implication clear, absent, irresponsible, exactly what people expected. The word jungle came last, wrapped in respectability, a slur delivered in educational syntax. The institutional machinery hummed beneath the interaction. No principal would question Collins. No parent could challenge her without being dismissed as emotional. The system assumed the adult was correct by design. Ruth stood perfectly still, her face burning. But something else happened beneath the humiliation. She was memorizing. Every word, every inflection. The way Collins smiled while delivering cruelty. Ruth understood with cold clarity that her father needed to know exactly what happened. Not a summary, the precise language, the specific insults, because her father dealt in specifics. That evening she sat at the kitchen table, her voice steady as she repeated Collins's words without embellishment. Across from her, Bumpy Johnson listened without interrupting, his face revealing nothing. The kitchen clock ticked louder with each sentence Ruth delivered. When she finished, he stubbed out his cigarette with deliberate pressure, looked at his daughter with eyes that had seen empires built and men broken, and asked one question. What was her name? Ruth answered, Margaret Collins. Bumpy nodded once, filing the information away with systematic precision. The clock marked each second with mechanical accuracy, counting down to the moment when Margaret Collins would learn that some lessons carry a price she never calculated. Harlem in 1952 operated on a frequency the rest of New York pretended not to hear. Two economies intersected like gears in a machine nobody wanted to examine too closely. The legitimate world ran through churches where women in white gloves counted Sunday collections and prayed for deliverance. The shadow economy moved through basement clubs where jazz musicians played until dawn and numbers runners collected slips from grandmothers betting nickels on dreams. Between these worlds walked an invisible network of janitors, porters, and kitchen workers who saw everything and reported to the man who regulated respect when the law would not. Ellsworth Johnson was not mayor, not alderman, not anyone whose name appeared on official documents. But when families faced eviction, Bumpy's money arrived in unmarked envelopes. When hospital bills crushed working people, anonymous payments cleared balances. When white store owners refused service or cops brutalized teenagers, consequences followed with mathematical precision. He was the unofficial regulator of dignity in a neighborhood the city had written off as expendable. His violence had architecture. It was not random chaos, but the enforcement mechanism for a community the law had abandoned. The morning after Ruth's humiliation, Bumpy activated this network with surgical efficiency. At 7:30 a.m., he met with Thomas, a janitor at PS 136, who had mopped those floors for 18 years and heard every conversation that echoed through empty hallways. By noon, he had spoken with 3 cafeteria workers and a substitute teacher who owed him for a nephew's legal fees. The intelligence painted a complete picture that made his blood run cold. Margaret Collins had a pattern. She told one boy his handwriting looked like chicken scratches and maybe his people were not meant for clerical work. She asked a girl if her mother had taught her hygiene or if that was too much to expect. She snatched trays from students she deemed too slow, using her authority like a cudgel. Families knew, but stayed silent, fearing retaliation through grades, through recommendations, through the 1,000 small ways a teacher could destroy a child's future. The background check revealed the source of her venom. Collins was born to Irish immigrants in Hell's Kitchen, divorced after 6 years, living in a rent-controlled apartment that consumed half her salary. Her father had been a union organizer who died believing the world owed him compensation for his suffering. Collins inherited his resentment without his fight, channeling her bitterness downward toward children who could not defend themselves. She saw Harlem's transformation as personal theft, her status diminishing as black families claimed space she believed belonged to people like her. The school's vulnerabilities emerged through careful questions. Principal Edward Mallory was weak, a bureaucrat who avoided confrontation and desperately wanted a legacy. The school board had approved plans for a new gymnasium, but funding remained incomplete. The budget gap was exactly $75,000, a figure that appeared in meeting minutes that somehow found their way to Bumpy's kitchen table. That evening, Bumpy sat with his wife Mame in their small living room. She asked why not handle it the old way. Bumpy lit a cigarette, considered his answer carefully. Violence was simple but temporary, he explained. It created martyrs and investigations. Systematic pressure, delivered through institutions, taught lessons that lasted generations. Money and fear, applied simultaneously, restructured behavior in ways bullets never could. At 9:17 p.m., the planning phase ended. Bumpy made 2 phone calls from the kitchen phone, his voice flat and transactional. The first went to his accountant, a nervous man who understood which questions never to ask. The second call went to Mickey Rosenstein, a construction company owner who had avoided a labor dispute because Bumpy made certain problems disappear. Mickey owed him, and debts in this world carried interest that compounded silently. Bumpy's instructions were simple and final. I need numbers by Friday morning. Then he hung up, stubbed out his cigarette, and began planning the systematic destruction of Margaret Collins's sense of security. Bumpy Johnson's financial architecture operated like a circulatory system designed to cleanse poison. Numbers racket proceeds flowed through funeral homes, where death certificates provided cover for cash transactions that had nothing to do with burial. Church-building funds accepted anonymous donations from foundations with respectable letterheads and board members who existed only on incorporation papers. Community scholarship programs laundered gambling revenue into educational philanthropy, transforming blood money into something the city was forced to thank him for. The system was elegant in its complexity, invisible in its operation, and absolutely effective at converting street profits into institutional leverage. The school's vulnerability crystallized through documents his network had acquired. P.S. 136 needed exactly $75,000 to complete their gymnasium project. 3 years of bake sales and small donations had raised only $42,000. The Board of Education had promised funding that never materialized. Principal Mallory's legacy project hung in bureaucratic limbo, one large check away from resurrection. Bumpy saw the opening with predatory clarity. Desperation created dependency, and dependency created compliance. Thursday morning at 9:30, Bumpy met his accountant Solomon Weiss in the back room of Abernathy Funeral Home, where formaldehyde masked the scent of cash being processed. Solomon was a nervous man with excellent reasons for his anxiety. He maintained ledgers that existed in the space between legal and catastrophic, understanding that curiosity shortened life expectancy. Bumpy laid out the requirement with surgical precision. $75,000 laundered through the Harlem Community Development Foundation, a legitimate nonprofit that existed primarily to sanitize illegal money. Solomon calculated withdrawal schedules and paper trails that would satisfy any auditor. The funds would be ready by Friday afternoon. At 1:15 p.m., Bumpy sat across from Reverend Marcus Powell in the modest dining room behind the church. Over fried chicken and coffee, they discussed moral cover. Powell ran scholarship programs that had sent 43 Harlem children to college. Bumpy had funded 37 of them through anonymous contributions that kept the Reverend's conscience clean and his programs operational. Powell would publicly endorse the donation as community investment in education. His reputation would sanitize the transaction, making refusal impossible without insulting a respected religious leader. Powell agreed, understanding this was not a request. The strategic decision had crystallized with brutal simplicity. Violence against Margaret Collins would create police investigations and martyrdom. Systematic pressure delivered through institutional channels would teach lessons that echoed through every classroom in Harlem. Bumpy understood white institutions with the clarity of someone who had studied their weaknesses for decades. They worshipped solvency and feared scandal. Money alone could be accepted and forgotten. Fear alone could be dismissed as empty threats. But money attached to consequences created psychological siege that restructured behavior permanently. Thursday night, Bumpy sat at his typewriter, keys striking paper like measured gunfire. The note contained no profanity, no direct threats. It was written in the language of concerned benefactors, precise and devastating. The donation came with understanding that PS 136 was a place of learning, not humiliation. Any teacher who believed their role was demeaning children for sport represented a liability to future funding. He didn't name Margaret Collins directly. The implication cut deeper than shouted threats. Friday afternoon, Bumpy assembled the final package with ritualistic care. A bank-certified check for $75,000, drawn on legitimate accounts, completely traceable to respectable sources. Behind it, the typed note that would decide Margaret Collins's future. Clipped to the back, a separate index card with one sentence. Ask Mrs. Margaret Collins if she recalls her lesson to Ruth Johnson on March 18th. He sealed the envelope and handed it to a trusted messenger who asked no questions and would remember nothing. Inside that manila package lay enough money to fund the school's dreams and enough leverage to destroy a career. Principal Mallory was about to receive salvation delivered by the man who would become his nightmare. Friday morning at 9:06, Principal Edward Mallory answered his phone, expecting the usual litany of complaints about broken radiators and overcrowded classrooms. Instead, District Superintendent Harold Brennan delivered news that made no sense. An extraordinary act of generosity had materialized overnight. $75,000 from the Harlem Community Development Foundation, endorsed by Reverend Marcus Powell, earmarked specifically for the gymnasium project that had languished in bureaucratic purgatory for 3 years. Mallory felt euphoria so intense he nearly wept. His legacy was saved. The exact amount he needed had appeared like divine intervention. Brennan's voice carried forced enthusiasm that barely concealed confusion about why this particular school had attracted such attention. But Mallory was too relieved to question providence. At 10:21, reality arrived by hand delivery. A messenger in a plain gray suit delivered an envelope with no return address, no postage, disappearing before questions could be asked. Inside, Mallory found clinical language that mimicked philanthropic correspondence while delivering surgical threats. The donation represented community investment in educational excellence. Any teacher who confused authority with humiliation represented a liability to future funding. Then the sentence that made his hands shake: ask Mrs. Margaret Collins if she recalls her lesson to Ruth Johnson on March 18th. The euphoria evaporated, replaced by cold sweat and dawning realization. Someone had penetrated the walls between his administrative sanctuary and the street. Someone possessed enough money to buy compliance and enough reach to know what happened inside room 3B on a random Tuesday afternoon. This wasn't charity, it was leverage. He had accepted money from someone who now owned his institution. At 11:15, he summoned Margaret Collins to his office. She arrived with brittle confidence that withered under his stare, When he read the sentence aloud, her face cycled through expressions she could not control. Denial came first, delivered with indignant authority about classroom management. Then minimization, framing the incident as necessary discipline that modern parents refuse to accept. Finally, blame, insisting Ruth Johnson had been disruptive and disrespectful. But Mallory heard something beneath her rationalizations that terrified him more than her racism: fear. Collins understood she had insulted someone connected to power she had not calculated. While Collins defended herself, Bumpy's network activated with systematic precision. At 11:47, her landlord received a visit from building inspectors who had never shown interest in that property before. Code violations materialized on official forms: faulty wiring, inadequate fire escapes, plumbing that violated updated regulations. Repairs would cost thousands the landlord could not afford. Simultaneously, 3 schools where Collins had submitted transfer applications received anonymous phone calls questioning her classroom management stability and suggesting inquiries into her disciplinary methods. By lunchtime, her professional escape routes were being sealed with methodical efficiency. The psychological siege intensified through calculated demonstrations of reach. Collins found expensive roses on her doorstep with no card, placed there while she was at work. A leather-bound book on etiquette appeared in her school mailbox, bookmarked to a chapter on respectful address. Her phone rang at 9:47 p.m., silence on the other end, then disconnection. Each incident alone was meaningless. Together, they constructed a message. Someone was watching. Someone knew her schedule. Someone could reach her anywhere. Paranoia consumed her composure. Every phone ring made her jump. Every car passing slowly outside felt like surveillance. She replayed the interaction with Ruth Johnson obsessively, realizing too late that her words had been recorded and reported with terrifying accuracy. The power dynamic had inverted completely. She was no longer the authority dispensing judgment. She was the subject of an investigation she could not control. At 3:30 p.m., Collins sat alone in her empty classroom, staring at a blank resignation letter she had drafted 17 times. Her hands shook as she folded it, placed it in the drawer, and locked her desk. Outside her window, a black sedan idled at the curb, its engine running, its passenger obscured behind tinted glass. She had not decided yet, but the walls were closing in with systematic precision, and Margaret Collins was running out of places to hide. The weekend dismantled Margaret Collins's stability with systematic precision that left no fingerprints. Saturday morning brought her landlord to her door, clutching paperwork that carried the weight of financial execution. Building inspectors had documented 17 code violations requiring immediate remediation. Emergency repairs would cost $8,000, expenses passed directly to tenants through assessments that had never existed before. Collins's share was $1,200, representing 3 months of her teaching salary due within 30 days, or eviction proceedings would commence. She stared at numbers that made no sense until they made perfect sense. Someone had weaponized bureaucracy against her with surgical efficiency. Her sister Catherine in Queens stopped returning calls after receiving what she later described as an anonymous tip about Margaret's classroom behavior. Catherine worked as a school secretary and could not afford association with controversy. The family connection severed through silence, calls going unanswered, support evaporating in 72 hours. By Sunday evening, Collins sat surrounded by roses she had thrown in the trash and books she was afraid to open, understanding that isolation was not accidental but engineered. Monday morning at 8:15, Collins arrived at PS 136 desperate for the sanctuary of routine. Instead, she found room 3B locked, a maintenance sign posted citing emergency repairs for ceiling damage that had not existed Friday afternoon. She was reassigned to the basement storage room, a windowless space that smelled of mildew and forgotten textbooks. Metal pipes groaned overhead, drowning out her voice. Students navigated narrow aisles between stacked boxes to reach mismatched desks. The message was unmistakable. She had been demoted from teacher to embarrassment, her authority stripped through bureaucratic maneuver that required no explanation or appeal. At 10:47 a.m., while her class completed worksheets under flickering fluorescent lights, the school secretary transferred a call to the basement extension. Collins answered, expecting routine business. Instead, a male voice delivered 9 words with clinical detachment. "Your resignation letter is overdue, Mrs. Collins." The line went dead before she could respond. The voice was unfamiliar, the tone matter-of-fact, the implication devastating. They knew she had drafted resignation letters in her locked desk. They had been inside her thoughts, her apartment, her professional life. The scope of surveillance crashed over her with suffocating completeness. She broke at 11:23, walking to Principal Mallory's office without appointment, without composure, without the brittle authority that had sustained her for 18 years. Words poured out in uneven bursts. She confessed everything about Ruth Johnson, the exact words, the contempt she had delivered with educational justification. She begged for protection, for transfer, for anything that would stop the invisible pressure crushing her existence. Mallory listened with the expression of a man calculating survival. He was terrified not of her racism, but of losing $75,000 and facing whatever alternative arrangements had been threatened in that typed note. The ultimatum arrived with bureaucratic finality: resign by Wednesday citing personal reasons, or face termination for cause with documentation that would follow her permanently. Mallory would not defend her, would not investigate, would not acknowledge this conversation had ever happened. She had become a liability to be excised before the infection spread to his gymnasium project and his legacy. Collins spent Tuesday evening at her kitchen table, drafting the letter that would end her teaching career. Pride demanded she fight, expose the coercion, appeal to union protections that existed only on paper. Survival demanded capitulation. She had insulted someone more powerful than she understood, someone who operated through institutional channels she could not challenge or even identify. The resignation letter emerged in careful handwriting, effective immediately, citing personal reasons that explained nothing and admitted everything. Wednesday morning at 8:15, Collins placed the envelope on Mallory's desk without ceremony. He accepted it without comment, relief visible in his shoulders as he filed away the problem that had threatened his $75,000 salvation. She cleared her belongings from the basement storage room in 17 minutes, carrying a cardboard box past students who watched with curiosity and teachers who avoided eye contact. As she descended the front steps of PS 136 for the last time, Collins saw the black sedan parked across the street, engine idling, exhaust visible in the March cold. The passenger window descended exactly 3 inches, not enough to reveal a face, just enough to communicate presence and confirm surveillance. She felt eyes tracking her movement, calculating, documenting. She did not see who watched, but she understood with absolute certainty that someone was logging her departure, ensuring the lesson was complete and the file could be closed. Margaret Collins walked away carrying everything she owned professionally in a box that suddenly felt impossibly heavy. While somewhere in Harlem, a man in a perfectly knotted tie crossed her name off a list with the same precision he used for everything else. Margaret Collins disappeared from PS 136 with the administrative efficiency reserved for problems nobody wanted to examine twice. The official record listed her departure as a routine transfer pending finalization, bureaucratic language that promised continuation while delivering termination with surgical precision. No transfer ever materialized. Her personnel file was sealed and forwarded to a district office where it gathered dust alongside other careers that ended without explanation or appeal. Teachers asked no questions. Parents received no notification. The system absorbed her removal the way it absorbed everything uncomfortable, through paperwork that obscured reality and protected institutions from accountability. Within 3 weeks, construction crews arrived to build the gymnasium that had existed only as architectural drawings for 3 years. Bumpy's $75,000 triggered additional anonymous contributions from Harlem businessmen who understood the message being transmitted through concrete and steel. Money flowed through legitimate channels, each donation accompanied by documentation that satisfied auditors while concealing sources with mathematical precision. The transformation extended far beyond construction. New textbooks replaced volumes held together with tape and decades-old information. Windows that had been sealed shut for years received repairs that had been deferred indefinitely. Art supplies, musical instruments, and after-school programs materialized with funding that arrived without bureaucratic delay for the first time in the school's history. P.S. 136 became evidence that Harlem protected its children when the city would not. Ruth Johnson returned to school expecting nothing and receiving something more valuable than apologies. No administrator acknowledged what happened in room 3B. No teacher referenced the incident that had triggered systematic institutional change. But tones shifted with measurable precision. Instructions arrived without condescension. Corrections came without contempt. Principal Mallory passed Ruth in hallways and addressed her as Miss Johnson with exaggerated formality that bordered on fear. She understood immediately that respect had been purchased through mechanisms she would never fully comprehend, delivered by a father whose methods remained invisible but absolutely effective. The broader message traveled through Harlem with the speed of essential information. In barber shops and beauty parlors, parents told their children that respect was not requested but enforced, that humiliation carried consequences the system could not protect against. The story became legend, details embellished and compressed, but the core truth remained intact. Someone had defended a child when institutions designed to protect her had failed completely. Bumpy Johnson's name was never mentioned in these conversations, but everyone understood who regulated respect when the law would not. Margaret Collins's fate unfolded with the inevitability of systematic destruction. Blacklisted from teaching positions throughout New York, through whispered warnings that followed her applications like shadows, she moved to Pennsylvania within 6 months. She worked retail in a department store, folding clothes and processing returns, her teaching certificate worthless and her references poisoned beyond repair. She never spoke about her time in Harlem, understanding that some chapters close permanently and revisiting them invited consequences she could not afford. Her silence became her survival strategy, chosen too late to save her career, but early enough to preserve what remained of her life. The gymnasium dedication occurred on a bright October afternoon, with dignitaries praising community investment and educational excellence. The bronze plaque mounted near the entrance read simply, "In honor of Harlem's children," with no donor names, no acknowledgement of sources. Bumpy had insisted on anonymity, understanding that visible credit diminished power while invisible influence compounded indefinitely. He was the community's immune system, attacking threats that legal institutions ignored or encouraged, using the tools of corruption to achieve something that resembled justice. 5 years later, in 1957, a young white teacher named Eleanor Hastings accepted a position at PS 136, eager to make a difference and convinced of her good intentions. During her first week, Thomas the janitor pulled her aside in an empty hallway, his voice quiet and his message delivered with grandfatherly concern that carried decades of accumulated wisdom. "Treat these children with respect," he said, his eyes holding hers with uncomfortable intensity. "Their families remember everything." Eleanor smiled politely, dismissing the warning as rambling from an old man who had worked there too long. She didn't understand yet that in Bumpy Johnson's Harlem, some lessons lasted forever, and the price of disrespect was calculated by people who kept accounts the system could never audit.